joined yet.
Yeah, no, we'll do a safety culture message here and let folks trickle in. So thanks everybody. I just started the recording, and thank you for joining our, this would be our 4th day for the Phase 4 Track 2 technical working groups to discuss the RAMP and GRC data templates. Let's, you have a quick safety message to get us started. So we're going to talk about candle safety. So set the mood without the risk. The National Fire Protection Association reports that candles cause an average of 20 home fires every day, with most incidents occurring during the winter months. Practicing proper candle safety can reduce the risk of fires and injuries, keeping your home warm and inviting. Here are some essential safety tips for candle safety. Keep away from flammable items. That goes without saying. Place candles at least 12 inches away from anything that can burn, such as curtains, paper, or furniture. Use stable holders. Always use sturdy, non-flammable candle holders to prevent tipping or melting hazards. Never leave candles unattended. Extinguish candles before leaving a room or going to bed. Never leave a burning candle unattended. And keep wicks trimmed to about 1/4 inch to provide high flames and excessive dripping. And avoid drafts. So keep candles away from open windows, vents, or fans, which can cause uneven burning or accidental tipping. And there is some additional information here from the fine folks at FEMA if you have any additional questions on candle safety. And I'm going to give a good shout out to my colleague Annabelle Gensler for these safety culture messages. This one was proper. I appreciate this one. I like candles. I don't use them enough, but I certainly don't think about the safety impacts of candles as much as I probably should. Okay, so let's move on to our kind of general info for the meeting. The meeting's going to be recorded. One or more decision makers may be present during the meeting, but no decisions will be taken. I'm not sure if there's a decision maker in the meeting at the moment. Doesn't look like it. But let's go ahead and do a quick roll call. So could Cal Advocates let me know if they're here?
Yes, we're here today.
Okay, great. Is Southern California Edison here?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. And is the Semper Companies here?
Yes, we are.
Okay. And is PG&E here?
Yes, present.
Okay. Anyone from the Utility Reform Network? No. Anybody from Energy Producers and Users Coalition Indicated Shippers? Okay. Anyone from the Mussey Grade Road Alliance? Or Protect Our Communities Foundation? Or the Utility Consumers Action Network? Okay, if there's any others that would like to be recognized, please feel free to raise your hand, or you can put the information in the chat and you'll be recognized there. Let's just go through a few attendee participation topics. If there's any IT related questions, I believe they can be directed towards Blake. And I'm not sure if anyone other than Blake is on the line, but Blake, if you could please put your email in the chat, I'd really appreciate that. And if folks have questions, you can reach out to Mr. Mitchell. And attendees have the ability to mute and unmute themselves. And attendees will, we're also asking everyone to kind of stay muted except for the Q&A period. We're going to let Cal Advocates run through their slides, and then in just a second, I'll transition to them. And then there's going to be lots of opportunity, just as there has been for the other technical working groups, for questions and discussion. So during the presentation portion of the session, you can also, enter any questions you have in the chat box. And if there's not enough time for all of us to respond to the chat box questions during the workshop, then SPD will collect those answers and circulate them to the service list after the workshop. So during the discussion, please use the hand raise function to speak, and I will do my best to call on attendees in order. After your question is asked, you might need to lower your hand, but it seems like Teams has been pretty good about lowering it for us. And so our agenda is going to be pretty fixed, as it has been for the other technical working groups. Cal Advocates will have approximately 20 minutes to run through their presentation. And then there's going to be, like I said, ample time for Q&A. We'll try to take a break around 11. I think we've been hitting that pretty well throughout the week so far. And so we'll try to do that again. And then we have another, hour and 20 minutes after that to continue the discussion. Tomorrow, SPD will be presenting, and then we will also have a discussion about whether or not to continue the discussion on Friday. With that, I think I'm going to hand it over to friends at Cal Advocates. So Chris, feel free to share your screen when you're ready.
Thank you, Eddie, and good morning, folks, and appreciate all that we've been learning from the other presentations this week and last week. So I'll let Anna Yang and Frankie also introduce themselves, and we welcome your questions and feedback following the walkthrough, and we can then consider that when we update the templates, which I believe are going to be due on Tuesday, February 18th. So go ahead, Anna.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Yang. I'm one of the senior analysts within the safety branch at the Public Advocates Office, also known as Cal Advocates. And then Frankie Lau will be presenting with me today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Frankie Lau, and I'm a utilities engineer with Cal Advocates, working in the safety analysis section. And as Anna mentioned, I'll just be going over some of the data visualization and spatial analysis for later in this presentation.
Okay, let me share my screen. Everyone see it just fine?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Okay, so here's our agenda for this morning. We'll start off with a brief background and overview and objectives of our templates, and then we'll get into the details of the templates, including how we can use the location data requested in our templates to map risk and progress. And then we'll get into our general recommendations before we begin our Q&A session. So here's a quick refresher on the background of our templates. In phase 3 of this proceeding, Cal Advocates recommended that phase 3 should prioritize adoption of 2 risk mitigation templates for use in the RAMP and GRC application. And the commission was persuaded of the benefits of the templates and authorized continuation of technical working groups. So here we are today. And there were 2 main issues that we raised in phase 3 that drive the need for these templates. The first was that the RAMP and GRC applications currently lack a standard method to consolidate and compare project level data to support utilities' risk mitigation proposals, and also to show how utilities determine their specific risk mitigation targets and forecasts. And also because of rising rates, as demonstrated in this graphic, you can see that the consumer rates are more than double the consumer price index, and rates have gone up significantly in the last 10 years. So as a step towards addressing this affordability issue, these templates would increase transparency regarding cost and effectiveness of risk mitigation, and that would enable the commission to more effectively evaluate ratepayer impacts of rate mitigation proposals. So we have since refined our phase 3 proposal and now present 2 new templates. The risk mitigation program template, which captures program level information such as program timeline, forecast versus actuals, and mapping of programs. And the second is the risk mitigation project template, which captures specific project level or RRU level information disaggregated from those programs. And we're proposing for these templates to be filed with the RAMP and GRC application and on an annual basis to capture project changes and progress. And I'll note that we might be using the term project and RRU interchangeably throughout the presentation. So the objective of these templates are to have all of this information in a consolidated format to help the commission to better evaluate risk mitigation programs and projects. and to understand how utilities determine the scope, timeline, and prioritization of each project. And having the specific spatial data for these projects would allow the commission and parties to visually see where utilities are proposing to do work, and then verify whether utilities are prioritizing work in the highest risk areas. Okay, so let me pull up the templates. So this is our risk mitigation program template. And the goal of this template is to be submitted as one file, which contains program level information for every mitigation program proposed in the RAMP and GRC application. And then for the interest of time, I'm not going to go over all the fields. But there are several fields with forecasts and actual values, such as, forecasts and actual costs and work units to be completed. And we wanted to include these in the template so we're able to compare how initial forecasts compare against what's actually done. And then the actual values would be filled out at the end of the project or GRC period or the end of the year, depending on what the field value is. And then we're asking for the RAMP, GRC, and WMP program ID, as applicable, because utilities currently use different naming conventions for mitigation across these different filings. And this field will allow more efficient tracking of mitigation across these different filings. And then we want to know, is this a capital or expense program? So that we know how this program would affect revenue requirement. Here we say unmitigated risk, but we meant pre-mitigated risk, so we'll make that update in our final proposal. But this will allow us to understand baseline risk before a mitigation is applied. And then the forecast and actual risk reduction. We can compare how much risk has been reduced after the mitigation are applied. The forecast and actual risk reduction using the risk neutral scaling function. So if a utility uses a risk averse scaling function or another scaling function, then this field would allow us to understand how that scaling function affects risk mitigation, risk evaluation, and decision making. And the risk reduction formula, and we also have some other formula values in the templates. This can be links or attachment to work papers or other supporting documents that can help us understand how the utilities came up with these numbers. Program effectiveness, how effective is the program expected to be compared to how it actually performed. And these fields would capture the cost throughout each year of the GRC period. The forecast cost in the first year and the actual cost spent in the first year, all the way up to the fourth year, as applicable. And similar, we have the amount of risk reduction expected compared to the actual amount of risk reduced from the mitigation, and the forecast work units to expected to complete versus what was actually done, and life cycle cost. This would be very helpful for us to understand the full life cycle cost of an asset, not just the cost to implement it, but also the cost of retirement and removal of the asset. Okay, let's jump over to the project template. So this is our risk mitigation project template. And the goal of this template is for each program disaggregated at the project level to be submitted as individual files. So for example, for the undergrounding program, there will be one Excel file that consists of all of the undergrounding projects. And then this would enable easier side-by-side comparison between different mitigation and the different spreadsheets. So we don't have to jump between different tabs or, so it'll be easier. The first one is the project RUID, this to help us easily identify each specific projects under a certain program, and the county and location that the asset will intersect. This field would allow us to assess whether the project would address high-risk areas, and Frankie will go over this in more detail later. Then we can jump down to mitigation effectiveness. How effective is this project at reducing the targeted risk in this area? And again, unmitigated risk, we meant pre-mitigated risk. And the cost, the forecast and actual cost and work unit expected for each year of the project to help us understand the pace and progress of the project. And of course, if a project doesn't expand out to the whole 4 years, only the first 2 or whichever years will be applicable will be filled out. And for a discussion of key constraint, this field is where the utilities can describe any constraint that they may encounter with implementing the project, so we can understand how it could affect the pace of the project and any factors or considerations impacting project choice. This field is where the utilities would provide a rationale for choosing this specific project over alternatives, so we can understand why this project was chosen. And speaking of alternatives, we also envision that this template could be used to compare alternatives. For example, for a proposed undergrounding program, a utility can present 2 alternatives here, where one alternative could be covered conductor and the other one could be a mixture of covered conductor and undergrounding. And then we can compare the cost, risk reduction, the effectiveness, and so forth. Okay, and now I'm going to pass it on to Frankie to discuss more about the location value in the project template. We jump back to the presentation. One.
All right, thanks, Anna. So as Anna had mentioned in this section, I'll be covering why mapping, or in this case, data visualization and spatial analysis is so important, right? Especially when we're talking about risk mitigation. So as you can see in the slide, one of the things we believe is that spatial data should be a requirement in the risk mitigation data submissions. We think having the ability to utilize data in a visual manner can benefit everybody's ability to analyze the large and complex data sets at a very high level and very quickly. And then if we wanted to, I apologize if that notification ping came through. Anyways, again, and if we want to, we can still dive deeper into the data because it'll still be there. But the visualization basically gives us a quick overview of what exists. An example of data visualization could be something like color coding or heat mapping, which is something we'll look at in a bit. And you would be heat mapping specific data over geographic areas or geographic maps, which help us identify where areas of interest may be relatively easily. So some of these examples where this might be useful might include looking at high priority projects based on where the highest risk areas are, or identifying projects based on the type of risk, such as wildfire or PSPS. Next slide, Anna. So in this slide, just really quickly, we have an example of the data visualization, semi-heat map style looking map. The data being visualized is data provided by PG&E on their monthly reports with regards to outages during while their fast trip programs are enabled. For reference, their fast trip program is referred to as Enhanced Powerline Safety Settings, which is long for EPSS. So at this point, I'm going to be switching over to a live map to see some of the dynamic interactions that are available with this type of example. Okay, Anna, can I get a confirmation it's up and good? Okay, thank you. So as we can see, this is a heat map showing the circuits that are experiencing outages where fast trip settings were active. For reference, this data is timed between 2021 and 2023, which we can see at the top right, if you can see my cursor hovering over the square. And right below that is actually a legend or a reference for the different colors representing from gold to red, representing the lowest to the highest counts of outages. And on the map, we can pretty quickly identify the areas of interest based off of where the deep red colors tend to group up or tend to appear. And another thing we can do from these maps is get a general idea of how outages are occurring or in general patterns. So we can see here that in the Sierra Nevada mountains, there's quite a cluster as well as along the coast, but it's generally more spread out and generally more yellow. So it's not super concentrated, but there's still outages occurring, which is something to take note of. So as I mentioned earlier, using data visualization, we can get a pretty good idea of what's going on. But if we want to, we can dive into the data deeper. And for this example, I'll be zooming into El Dorado. So just that could be El Dorado County, to be specific. And as I hover over the different circuits, we start to see a pop-up. And this pop-up basically gives us the underlying data, at least a summary of the underlying data showing the number of outages that have occurred over the past over those 3 years and within each individual year. And depending on the user needs, these tables obviously can be manipulated to display different things, again, depending on what the end target for the mapping is. So Anna, you can go ahead and take back control over the presentation. I apologize.
Just a moment. It seems like Dan, did you have a question?
Yeah, do you want us to wait and hold off? I mean, I'm happy to hold the question if you guys want to finish.
Yeah, I think we're getting there pretty
No
short
problem.
order. Okay, thank you.
Definitely circle back around to that question. So keep it in mind. And in this slide, we just have a different example of data visualization. Excuse me. Still getting over a little bit of a cold, so I apologize. This map that we're looking at here gives us a general overview of the distribution system in El Dorado County, which we just looked at. And this particular map is actually available on the state auditor's website. It is interactive as well. So if you're interested, feel free to visit and play around with it. On the right side of the map, we see a legend that provides description for the different colors: green representing undergrounding, blue for covered conductor, red for bare conductor. There's other and unknown. And just using the image here, we can pretty quickly identify where most of the undergroundings occurred, which here appears to be on the left side or the west side of the map. And we can also pretty quickly identify that most of the conductor in this county still is bare conductor. So again, something else for consideration when we're looking at these types of map, things to look for. Possible way this information could be used is if you overlay this with like a risk layer or a risk map, you can identify where it might be suitable for more system hardening, or if the existing system hardening has been done in appropriate areas by means of the highest risk areas first. Next slide, please, Anna. So here we have another example of how data can be visualized, which allows us to perform spatial analysis. And this is really the key part, is the spatial analysis. This example is a case where we have to perform the spatial analysis in order to kind of understand what's being done and where it's being done, and how it's impacting the system overall. Here it's an example of a circuit between 2022 and 2023, where red represents the overhead circuit and green represents the undergrounding. And you can see between the two submissions, there's a large section in the center that goes from red to green, representing that it's been undergrounded. The circuitry can be overlaid in this in this example, it's overlaid with a risk profile by PG&E's, their wildfire risk model, specifically the WDRM version 3. And that model represents a snapshot of PG&E's risk profile, I believe in 2022, where each pixel, and it's kind of hard to see it unless you're kind of zoomed in, but each pixel represents its own risk score for the area covered by the pixel. And excuse me. So using these different layers, some of the things we can do is by identifying the areas where overhead has been removed and undergrounding has been installed, we can aggregate the pixels and find out the theoretical risk reduction that's been done based on this system hardening. And this will give us a general idea, but it's definitely up for refinement. And as some of you can probably imagine, there's hundreds of thousands of rows, if not more, of data just behind these types of visualizations. These visual representations are much more effective than communicating what's going on in just the tabular data that we see through tables. So being able to spatially analyze the data behind the risk mitigation activities is going to be absolutely necessary if we want to have a very accurate understanding of the effects of the system hardening projects that are occurring and going forward. So as a summary, these are just a few examples of how data visualization and spatial analysis can be used. But at the end of the day, it can only be done if we have the right data to start with. And in some cases, having that data is the only way we can understand it through spatial, understand what's being done through the spatial analysis. So I hope that these examples show you how powerful these tools are and why it's necessary for us to continue using them as we move forward in this process. Back to you, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Frankie. So this slide summarizes our recommendations. The first one is that these data templates should include mitigation program and project or RU information as described in the templates here. And the second, that utilities should provide location spatial data so we can enable mapping of risk mitigation programs and projects and pinpoint areas of experiencing the highest risk and also to track progress, just like Frankie demonstrated earlier. And then we should start utilizing this template starting with SCE's 2026 ramp filing and then filed on an annual basis on May 15th, consistent with the ramp and GRC application schedule. And finally, the commission should authorize SPD authority to update these templates periodically as we get more experience with them. And that concludes our presentation. We can open up for questions now.
Great, thanks, Anna. Dan, I think you had your hand up first in the middle of the presentation, so why don't you go ahead and ask your first question?
Yeah, I guess I think this is something that the IOUs and SCE has pointed out for years, is a significant amount of this is based on actuals, and the ramp and the GRCs are forecasts. And so if you go back to your last slide, are you saying that these templates need to be filled out every year in addition to an RMAR, in addition to an RSAR? Like, it's very confusing as to how this is actually a data template for a forecast in a ramp or a rate case, as opposed to after the fact analysis. So, I mean, that's just one of the questions I have, but I'd really appreciate that answer, because it just seems like this is more of an after the fact analysis framework than it is for a forecast, when the IOUs have been very clear we don't have all this locational specific information years in advance for when we file the ramp in the rate case.
I'll jump in on that. So to the extent that a utility doesn't have the information because it is going to be filled in at a later time. So if these templates are filed annually, in the beginning, when it's a forecast, it will not have some of the information. And as we've discussed previously when we were in phase 3 of this, that information, if the utility doesn't have it, then it would either leave it blank or explain why it doesn't have the data. One thing I think in having an important reason for having the actual information available once it's completed or once it's available is it goes back to actually the cycler risk assessment that was in an earlier version of this RDF proceeding, which is a circle of risk assessment. So it begins with the analysis of risk, development of the risk mitigation programs, proposals, and then at the end, there's an evaluation of the effectiveness, and that actually—
And isn't that the RMAR? I guess I'm confused. It seems like you're creating a whole new template and report that needs to be filed annually. but this seems to be what the RMAR should be focusing on, is the accountability of our risk work. This is a data template that's more should be a forecast of data, not actuals, which is what I think all three of the IOUs and even SPD's templates that we'll be discussing tomorrow are. And so it's just, I'm really struggling with how this fits into the intent of this data templates.
So I was just going to finish off that explanation is that in that circle, the end of the cycle, or and it's kind of along the lines of the plan, do, check, act concept, is evaluate the effectiveness, and that would make sense that that would be step one in developing a risk mitigation proposal for the next round, because rather than just forecast, what do we expect, what do we think that can be achieved, what do we expect will be the results, both in terms of risk reduction, but also in terms of progress, which is what these templates are also capturing, is, the progress of implementing the forecast, the progress in achieving the work units, and then evaluating whether those expected results are actually being achieved, so that the utility can then go back and see, okay, did we achieve, or did we have the results that we expected to have when we developed that proposal? So it would be an important element to include in the data templates to the extent that information is available. That way everyone can see, okay, yeah, this is achieving what was expected. And it can be updated as soon as the next round of reporting happens, and then everyone can understand if we're on the right, if everyone's on the right track. I don't know if that's, so there are things with the RMARs which are going to be also in development. So there may be some aspects that are not included in the RMARs, but that are included in the templates, to the extent that there's some data that's similar or identical, then maybe it would be reported in one or the other. But the templates is developed, in phase 3 to capture information that would be useful for both the RANs and the GRCs.
No, I think we just fundamentally disagree on the purpose of these, so I won't continue to harp on it, but it just logistically and procedurally just doesn't make any sense to me. Sorry. I'll let others ask any questions, but I do have a couple others, but I'll see if anyone else has anything they want to ask.
Yeah, go ahead, Oni.
I have a follow-up question. So Chris, actually I like your approach. So basically what you are saying, responding, so you are collecting data which might be originally or initially forecast, and then maybe for next GRC or even the, basically this is a question, are you envisioning that next GRC, the next cycle GRC or RAM, you just keep updating the previous data? Or all of the update would happen the same RAM? Basically, my question is, your template is for like several RAM or several GRC connecting the data together, or put the layers on top of each other?
Yes, it is a recurring report, similar to the RSAR report, similar to the expected RMAR reports. Those are all annual. This would be annual as well. And it would be an update. And to the extent that, one thing when we were talking about this in phase 3 is, if there is information, like we talk about multiple years, there's going to be years that are not simply not going to be available. So in that sense, it wouldn't be, there'd be nothing to report. But it would be an update, so that we're not just waiting for, the ramp and the GRC cycle are quite a lengthy process. And so this is to get that information, to get that insight on an annual basis, and that way everyone's going to be able to see if it's meeting expectations.
Thank you.
Yeah, Vincent, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention that, yeah, we kind of fundamentally don't agree with this being like this report being also on an annual basis, also being on some kind of regular basis, kind of similarly with the RMAR. You know, those have been already discussed previously. The need, the necessity for those things have been acknowledged. This one here, you know, I think it leads us down a slippery slope that PG needs to really oppose to, because then, you know, we can start with annual information. Does that mean we have to update our risk numbers annually? All this kind of work, it's not been envisioned. It's not how we use the information. So we're really having a hard time with this report as well.
I hear you. I believe that this information is useful and valuable, and there may be issues that a utility comes across specific, and in that sense, the utility could identify it in its report, explain it, and that way we could consider it, or the commission would consider it in constant improvement. So, you know, these are templates to be used to the extent they're going to be useful to the commission. And to the extent that there are improvements or different ways of updating this information as they're being implemented, then those can be considered for updates. It's, you know, the WMP guidelines, for example, those get updated, I believe, on an annual basis. So, you know, to that extent, we would expect that any kind of data template or RSAR or RMAR could expect to be, you know, revised going forward.
Yeah, Vincent, you're more than welcome to continue.
Yeah, I just want to mention that, you know, the commission has already expressed that, you know, the RSAR and the RMAR are the avenues to have this kind of information. But here we are proposing a new channel, which we haven't had the discussion to talk about that yet, and we haven't even built out the channels that the commission envisioned, and now we're starting on a new kind of potential approach. I think we just need to, you know, slow down and just build out the RMAR, build out, you know, that series of reports first.
I mean, Vincent, I just wanted to clarify. I mean, that's why we were having these technical working groups, and after the discussion of RMR, and I think that you know, the opening comments came in on Monday, and so there is a certain amount of discussion that's already happening on the RMR. But I appreciate what you're saying and your perspective on this. Dan, but before you ask your question, I just wanted to get one clarification from Vincent. Your first kind of question, it seemed to be saying something about that your PG&E doesn't expect to be updating their risk models on an annual basis. Did I hear that correctly?
Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, right? It's like, you know, and for us to be able to do this on a cycle, you know, it's gonna be challenging. You know, some of the risks here, we might not have the ability to update them annually.
Oh, I see. Because I don't remember you bringing that up during the RMR conversation, and the, you know, the RMR was also expecting that there would be annual updates, and so that was a little bit of a surprise to me. And also just thinking about you know, the way that the utilities provide updates to you know, OEIS in terms of wildfire mitigations. I understand that it might be different for some risks, but I mean, in that context, you actually provide quarterly updates. Is that correct? Like, you provide the quarterly data reports?
I don't want to speak specifically about, you know, one risk or other, but, you know, it's like, yeah, wildfire is probably on a different time frame from other risks, you know. But here we are, you know, it's like we are going to do this very wildfire-centric approach to the rest of all of our risks, and that's like going to be an expansion on, you know, the requirements on our companies, our groups, so on and so forth.
Sure, I can understand that. It's just that if one risk is, if you're capable of doing it at a quarterly update, then it would seem that an annual update for the other risks is probably doable. And I just wanted to make sure that that I was hearing you correctly about what you were saying about that. You mean, did you want to respond directly to that? I did want to make sure that Dan gets.
I
Go
want to
ahead.
answer to that question. Are you saying that PG&E is currently updating the risk models every quarter for WMP?
I don't know. I know that you file quarterly data reports to OEIS on a quarterly basis.
That is not the risk model updates.
So you do not, when you complete projects, you do not update your risk model?
Right. We do not.
I see. And so for the annual updates to RMAR, then you would not be updating your baseline risk. You would not be updating your, you would not be providing the risk reduction it would be the estimated risk reduction based off of the completed amounts. I'm wondering if the question is, are you thinking that you need to change something about your models in order to comply with the ability to report out how much risk you're reducing? Is that the concern?
I think that risk models generally takes time and efforts to update, right? So if we are thinking about the wildfire distribution risk model, there was version 2, version 3, version 4. It is not even annual refresh, right? Maybe every 2 years or every 3 years. However, I think what you're referring to might be at every quarter, like we have the work progress, right? Then we can update based on the work that was done, how much risk reduction that was achieved, right? It's different from like fully refreshing the risk model.
Right. No, I don't see, at least from what Chris has presented today, I'm not quite clear on why the data that he's requesting would require a complete refresh of the model and a new model update.
Well, it depends, right? Because these templates are supposed to be used to look at our risk from a ramp standpoint, from a GRC standpoint, when all that stuff is kind of forward-looking. It's like if we have to do that every year, does that mean essentially we're doing like ramp style analysis every year, GRC analysis every year, and so that's why it's like I think we just need to be cautious about instituting new requirements on without more consideration.
And I would say especially duplicative requirements, it seems like. And once again, like what I wanted to emphasize is the ramp in the GRC, the data we provide at RRU or program level is still hypothetical. And it's not even necessarily what's authorized. So going back and saying like this ramp project, which may or may not have even made it into the GRC, which may or may not have been authorized, and then providing actuals and things like, it's just going to get messy. And I don't think parties fully understand that concept that we put something in the ramp, it may or may not make it into the rate case because of any updates we do in between that year. And then the rate case may authorize, a certain dollar amount and stuff, but it doesn't necessarily authorize at the project or the RRU level. And so I think there's this false sense of this data. And so what would we do with projects that weren't in there? We'd have to add more lines and things. And then every year continually, like I think Vince was trying to get at, reforecast at the project level for all of our risks. And I'd really like to know how this applies to non-asset-based risks. And therefore then provide, updated BCRs, updated actuals for everything at the RRU level, in addition to any additional information that's required in the RSAR, the SPMR, and the future RMARs. It just seems like there's a lot of duplicative information in this template compared to what the IOUs and SPD are presenting. So.
Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, so Part of the purpose of these templates, as it was mentioned, is to consolidate the information. So there is a lot of information that the utilities present in the different proceedings. This is part of the intent here is to bring together some of the key aspects. Another part of it is to capture the project level information. So if we can have this consolidated information, even if it's duplicative to some extent somewhere else, it could be in a work paper, it could be, you know, in another report, but to be able to bring together some of the key information, which is what Cal Advocates proposes in its templates, then we can then make it a more readily available, simpler comparison, and then the ability to sort and filter. We're not, you know, it's not prescriptive. You know, it's not saying that a new risk model needs to be, you know, used, or the intent is, for example, if you're using a particular risk model, then that was used to develop a particular project, I don't think the utilities are planning to change that risk model in general during the course of that project. So not that they couldn't if they felt it was warranted, but you know, based upon the risk model that was used in developing it, it would give insight into whether the results of that mitigation were being achieved. And it's going beyond, you're right, it's going beyond the forecast, but trying to also understand, is the forecast accurate? Is it realistic? Is it being achieved? To give a lot more confidence to the commission when it has to authorize different types of mitigations. Now they can see, okay, utility asserts that it would achieve this level of risk reduction or along this certain timeline. Are those results being achieved? And it's on a, you know, it's not a quarterly basis, it's an annual basis, kind of like the same used for RSARs and RMARs. That way, that information will become available sooner rather than waiting for the next GRC, you know, 4 years later, which is then going to encompass another 4 years after that. Having this information available to the decision makers and commission when it's having to make these tough authorizations.
But you don't have to wait 4 years. You just said we have annual RSARs, and we will more than likely have some type of RMAR on a similar type of basis.
Correct, and we're looking at this to consolidate.
So what is different from this filing than those two?
Well, one big difference is the project level information. That way we can understand that the utility is targeting the projects that are going to have the greatest risk, that it's what the cost benefit is for those risks, and have insight into not just averaging across a large program what the risk reduction will be, because it's a key thing is, you know, there's going to be a lot of mitigation work expected, right? We're expecting to see a lot of requests for significant, you know, large mitigation programs expensive. So it's good to understand that, have insight into understanding where those projects are occurring, the ones that are being implemented, how it's targeting the greatest risks, and then understanding that it's achieving the results that were achieved. Well, that were forecast.
I mean, I guess we still haven't even determined the RMAR levels, so I'm not sure that that's accurate. And I thought a lot of the point in tranching, which seems to be missing from your templates, is to ensure that we are targeting the highest areas. So I don't know, I think, you know, the IOUs we provided, at least I'll say SCE provided extensive comments that we thought on the challenges of doing the RMAR analysis just to begin with. And like, once again, this just falls in line with those comments. But Wendy, I know you've had your hand up, so I want to let you ask your question or comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Wendy.
Hi, thanks. I just want to mention that I think what some of what Cal Advocates is recommending, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it might be similar a little bit to the system hardening accountability report that the commission is requiring PG&E to do on an annual basis. Not the, I mean, but it's going beyond that because it's asking for project level information. And just for everyone to know that came out of the last PG&E GRC decision, where the commission did authorize a specific amount of system hardening, both undergrounding and covered conductor, and then required PG&E to file annual system hardening reports and showing by project, how the risk reduction is being achieved, over each year. I think what Cal Advocates is recommending to also add a spatial layer to that could be extremely helpful. We just have, the 3 utilities that are involved here, just so large that it's very hard to, just be looking at these data tables and really get a visual, get a big picture understanding of, where are the highest risk, and is the work being done in the highest risk areas, and how is that changing over time? And one last comment I would say is that, we do have lots of different mitigations happening. And so it's hard also to understand, for example, the map that Cal Advocates presented about EPSS. It could be extremely helpful to see, are the mitigations reducing, EPSS over time, PSPS, for example. And then lastly, I'll just mention, I live in PG&E service territory, and it's been very interesting the last couple of weeks. There are commercials coming out by PG&E where PG&E is stated we have reduced 90% of our wildfire risk on our lines using sensors, using other things. Well, if we could be like seeing what is EPSS reducing, what is this, what is the system hardening reducing? If we could have like visualizations and see, where are the remaining 10% of the risk that PG&E is talking about? They're kind of, making this claim, but we don't even have a big picture view of all that. So I don't know. I just wanted to add.
I think all of this is great for discussion in the RMAR. I just don't know that this is the appropriate template or discussion for these types of analyses. I agree. All of that is very useful from a mitigation accountability, not from a template / work paper that's based on a forecast.
But what I will say is that, the utilities, you guys are continuing to do work over time. So it's not just about what was done in the last, what was authorized in the GRC and what you accomplished, but it's also the next ramp, the next GRC. Are you focused in the areas that, it's getting that big picture over time,
again, I thought that was the point of tranching, is we would show in our next applications, we are targeting the areas that have the highest risks and things of that nature. Hypothetically, the rate case would then also do it, and the RMAR would try and show that accountability that yes, we did. So once again, I just don't see that this should be in this area. I think it is very relevant for the RMAR discussion.
Well, I can say from reviewing Edison's, it's very, very difficult to get an idea, a bigger picture idea of what's going on from the way the tranching is done. So I would be very, very open to having some better way to understand where the work is being done and what's happening over time, and then where are the risks left for the next GRC filing.
All right, well, we fundamentally disagree on that, but we can keep that for a second conversation. Vincent?
Dan, you said what I was going to say, which is like, I feel like we had this discussion about where the greatest risk was and so on and so forth. And it was, you're right, we had the discussion when we talked about tranching. So I feel like, spatial information, I'm not going to sit here and tell you spatial information is not useful, right? It's like, but it's like for those purposes, Wendy, that you mentioned, is like, tranching, we've covered that. I think tranching is more effective because you can look at maps and you can miss stuff on looking at maps, right? Whereas, the tranching is like, it puts all that information right in front of you, and we discussed this, but enough of that.
And I also might just add from a locational basis, like I know like we were able to provide it to the extent we have it. A lot of our risks, the locational stuff of our controls and mitigations are either NA or just it doesn't make any sense to provide it for like cyber or employee training, contractor type stuff. But a lot of our risk related locational information would be considered confidential because it allows bad actors to know where in our service territory our highest risk is and where they could potentially go after certain areas if they wanted to do arson or other things. And so, while we can provide it, I would just like to, emphasize a lot of that would be considered confidential.
And then, but it would be available to, interveners or parties who have signed an MOU with
Correct. In the rate case, we typically provided a public and a confidential file that had that information, that anonymized circuits and stuff. But you wouldn't be able to graph the anonymized because it would be anonymized.
Right. No, but parties would be able, parties to the proceeding who have signed an MOU with the utility would be able to get access to that data. Now, the question I wanted to ask though was that couldn't we also include like a tranche layer within the data within the geospatial data, so that way you could actually see where the riskiest tranches are left on the system. That could be actually a really visually appealing thing to see.
I don't know that it's a contiguous area.
Right.
Tranching is
Of
really
course
like
not.
that could be a real eyesore from a visualization perspective. I don't know that we've graphed it, so I can't confirm it, but I would estimate that it would be a nightmare if you have 25 with different colors trying to see that on a map.
Not necessarily, because actually those colors could be in gradations, and you may kind of similar to like your when you guys present like your PSPS presentations, you provide like your wildfire threat maps and your wind burns, and those also are made with different colors, and they you have a lot of gradations in between, and so you might see that there's patterns that are readily available, and make a lot of, I don't know, to me actually the idea of having geospatial data that has an overlay of tranches could be actually a really important way to understand where these RRUs actually being targeted. And that could be something that's actually really important for the ramp. It's not, as it gets updated. I mean, I understand that Cal Advocates is interested in learning about how things change over time at the RRU scale, but even at the program level, at the tranche level, trying to get a sense of that, I think would be interesting. I did want to ask Chris. I mean, we'll take a break here maybe after this question, but and then I do want to, we've kind of like talked at a really high level for most of this opening presentation, and I kind of wanted to circle back on some of the details because I think that there's a lot of individual variables that we should probably talk through and make sure that everybody's understanding what the individual variables are within Cal Advocates template. So we can do that after 11. But Chris, I had kind of an additional high level question, which is that why didn't you include tranches in either of the templates, in either the program or the project, the RRU level template?
That's actually a really good takeaway. And I first became aware of it, I think, when PG&E was giving their presentation talking about RRU, and then they had a column that talked about the tranche. So I think that that's actually a really good suggestion that I'm hearing that would be good to add.
Okay, great. And I think that'll help clarify one of my other questions, but it's in the weeds, and so maybe we can come back to it after we take a break, and I can throw up the break slide, and we can try to come back at 11:10. One sec. All right, thanks everybody. All right, everybody, stop sharing and maybe let Chris share his screen again when he gets back and is ready to go. Great. So yeah, I was mentioning just as we were kind of wrapping up that I think it would be kind of beneficial to maybe also have like some slightly more in the weeds questions. You know, if there's more kind of high level questions towards the end, we could always continue that conversation. And then, of course, there's always you know, more time available on Friday for us to kind of have a more high level discussion if we feel that's necessary after tomorrow. So, Chris, I was wondering if you could. I'm going to take the liberty to ask the first question. And I was wondering. Could you maybe share? I think you have like your data fields all on like one Excel file. Yep, that's the one. I had a quick question about the GRC mitigation program unmitigated risk field, and I just wanted to know like how do you envision this being calculated? Is this the sum of the you know, is this the sum of all the monetized values? Like, is this the entire risk associated with that particular risk? I wasn't quite sure what you were envisioning for this field.
Yeah, so we as as Anna discussed when we went past this one, in our just to be clear, first off, is that we would call that pre-mitigated risk.
Right.
And we do have some understanding from, like, for example, earlier, Frankie shared a graphic of comparing 2022 to 2023 of undergrounding versus overhead converted to undergrounding. And in that graphic, I don't know if we could.
No, I remember what the graphic looked
Okay,
like. I
there were
guess my
little
question though.
there were little
Yeah, there's little.
squares.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so those were also color coded, and so those represented the an attribute for, you know, for that particular type of risk. And I think
Right. But I think
uh,
that was for just like a segment of
it was.
and so that's why this appears to be in the program template. And so I was curious, like, how what is this value? How is it calculated? And is it the entire risk for wildfire? Would it just be all wildfire risk?
So
For,
each of the fields in the project would roll up and be aggregated at the program level. So this would be just a kind of like an aggregation of whatever risk was done at the project level, assigned for that. You know, what is the risk that is being targeted, and the value for that, and what will be the risk reduction, and then the overall. This would just be an aggregation of those fields.
right. That sounds that's a more clear description. I think what you just provided. I think it, you know, just in the field description, it might be beneficial to just kind of like you know, mention that this is the pre-mitigated risk targeted by the projects associated with this particular program.
Got it. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay.
But to be clear, it wouldn't be the entire risk. Like if okay, so let's just say the risk was 1,000 wildfire, cyber, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. And we're targeting like 20% of it, so it'd be 200. So the number there would be 200, not the 1,000, correct? In my hypothetical example.
That's what I heard from Chris. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be for that program. Right.
Okay, great. Yeah, that helps clear up that that question. And then I guess the other question I had is regarding the GRC mitigation program forecast total risk reduction and the actual total risk reduction. And like, I guess my question is, were you expecting that this would be using and actually I guess it goes to the pre-mitigated risk question too. Are these are you expecting this to be in the risk neutral scaling, and or do you imagine that this would be like reflective of how the risk scaling is used by the utility?
So that's a good point. I believe the risk neutral. Okay, so the risk neutral scaling is right now we have it as the row below the one that's being highlighted, I believe.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So this would be an opportunity to be able to compare what are the results using whatever scaling that the utility is using.
Okay.
Versus what would be in a neutral, if it were doing neutral scaling.
Great. Thank you. That helped clarify that. And then my next question is geared towards the GRC actual mitigation program effectiveness and the actual mitigation effectiveness. And these are one is in the program template, and then the other one is in the project template. But in both cases, I was just curious about how you envision the utility calculating actual mitigation program effectiveness.
So, and this again would be an aggregation of what would be in the project level. But in terms of how the utility would report its project level effectiveness, this isn't prescriptive. It's to try to get insight into how a utility assesses, the effectiveness of its specific project. So if a utility does a project in a certain using a certain defined project, then it could capture later after did it achieve the effectiveness that it used. And and this doesn't say how the utility would measure its effectiveness. It would depend upon the utility's own, approach to that and the risk and the mitigation, but that would be captured at the project level and then aggregated up as an overall insight on the program level to see, is it achieving the effectiveness that it anticipated?
So if I'm understanding correctly, at the program level, you're thinking of the effectiveness as like an average of the effectiveness values from the projects that they implemented.
So in a sense, I guess it would be, but it would also be dependent upon how the utility is targeting its greatest risk and implementing mitigations along those greatest risks. So, for example, if a utility were targeting the greatest risk and putting in projects in place and completing those projects to address those greatest risks, then I would expect the program level effectiveness to be greater than if a utility were instead, looking at projects that were not necessarily the highest priority or for whatever reason that it gave in terms of not targeting the greatest risk. So I just want to point out, yes, it is an average, but the average could change depending upon the utility's success in targeting and completing the project level mitigations that address the greatest risk and provide the best benefits. And similarly, I think for, benefit cost information. So, if is a utility targeting at the project level the projects that are going to achieve the greatest risk reduction per dollar, and then that would then be captured when it rolls up into the program level. Does that get at what you're after?
But I just want to make sure that I understood what you were saying about the actual mitigation effectiveness. Is that both the forecast and the mitigation effectiveness would essentially, and the actual, both of them would be determined by the utility. You're not necessarily providing them like a specific formula in which they have to determine the actual mitigation effectiveness there. So even the actual is, that's something that the utility is allowed to determine.
These templates do not prescribe how that will be determined. And that's not to say that there couldn't be value in having a standardized way for reporting effectiveness. But these templates at this, in this version of templates, it doesn't prescribe exactly how that would be determined.
Okay. Yeah, Dan, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you recall when we presented Monday, I believe Monday, yeah. For some of ours, like wildfire, I think we have 60 some sub-drivers, each which have a different effectiveness value. And so each project, depending on the probability of an ignition, depending on the drivers, all have a different one. So like, I'm not sure exactly how we would calculate it. I'm sure we could do some averages and things, but I just want to, make sure that you're aware that like, we don't have to necessarily present a program effectiveness. We present mitigation effectiveness at, more granular levels, which we could roll up potentially, but it would be a roll up depending on some type of mathematical formula. So it may not be as specific, and just, I think, SCE at least, and I know we're in the middle of comments, so I don't want to get into specifics, but I think we provided some concerns we have of trying to provide this information even at a program level, let alone at an actual project level, given the fact that when we calculate a BCR, some of the benefit streams go out 60, 70 years based on the useful life of a project. So it may seem easy to just put a description in, but the actual calculation of that value is not as straightforward.
Okay. Yeah, Chris, did you have any thoughts about that, or?
The only thought about that is, so a utility will use some kind of rationale for selecting its risk mitigation projects. And so having that information, whether the utility has like a complicated formula for selecting it, or maybe more of a simpler formula for selecting it, but having that information available so that the commission can understand those risk reductions. And then if it's based upon, a number of factors that are then feed into an overall analysis of the effectiveness of that mitigation, having that information as an actual afterwards would be useful. It's to get at like understanding that the forecast, the results, are they achieving what the utility was expecting? However, the utility determines that. And like I mentioned earlier, these templates aren't intended to, at this stage, they're not intended to prescribe how a utility were to do that. Perhaps down the road, there'll be, with use, there would be an understanding of, oh, this is actually the best way to determine effectiveness, and the commission might want to move in that direction. But at this point, the templates weren't trying to address that. And the commission may already have ideas on how to do that, but these templates don't really get to that aspect of it.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. That helps clarify. I just wanted to point out that on the project template, there's actually 2 mitigation effectiveness fields. At least in the spreadsheet, it's columns K and T that are basically identical.
Yes, that we noticed
okay.
that after we sent it over. Yes, thank you.
No worries. Yeah. No, and then I think if there's no other comments or questions on effectiveness, I had another question about forecast total life cycle cost and the GRC actual total life cycle cost. I was just curious, like, could you clarify a little bit about how you're thinking about this being calculated? Like, is the first is that is it the intention that this be presented in nominal dollars or real dollars?
When the difference between nominal and, you mean real is the actual?
No, like, are they discounted or like, is this supposed to be like you know, like a present value calculation, or are you just thinking about like the expenditures essentially that are associated with this particular project?
So one thing that the templates do not get into that I think other templates do get into is the discount information. So
Right.
that isn't captured. Not that it couldn't be, but it isn't in the ones that we put together. But in terms of life cycle cost, the intent of this is to really capture the overall net present value cost. I would imagine that it incorporates all of the costs that can be associated with a particular type of mitigation. And the concern behind that is, for example, there could be high upfront cost capital programs that will be substantial, and the commission may have to choose between that and expense programs that are generally lower cost, but the expense programs are accrued yearly, whereas the capital program is going to be amortized. And then but over the life cycle, one of the concerns is that that in order to be able to compare different programs, that it's important to understand the total cost of the mitigation program. So, for example, when it comes to pole replacement, pole replacement can have a very large replacement cost value and a net negative salvage value at the end. At which time, if I understand the process correctly, the utility will seek recovery of that significant cost, and it will be incorporated as a depreciation. Well, if there is a program, whether it's undergrounding or pole replacement or other large capital program, it would make sense that the commission understand not just the cost to install the mitigation or to get it up and running, but also understand the total cost, life cycle cost of it, which could be significant when it comes to having to replace that asset. So that's what the intent of here is, to understand that. And then, a capital program also costs ratepayers in terms of the rate of return that the utility earns on the capital program. So the intent of this was to request, and it came up early in one of the early RDF workshops, are utilities capturing all of that information when they're looking at their mitigation programs? And it wasn't clear to me whether it is, but this is kind of to make it explicit that there's a place here to report the entire life cycle cost. So something's not being left out, because that could then skew the selection of the best program in terms of cost benefit for the ratepayers.
Okay. Yeah, I guess. Oh, go ahead, Dan. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of complications in trying to do a life cycle cost analysis when things like rate of return, taxes, depreciation can change year over year and things of that nature. It's just very difficult to isolate in our results of operation model things at a program level and give you a meaningful number, let alone if this would ever apply to a project level, trying to get a PVRR, because that's not actually what you're asking for right now. You're asking for like direct costs and not a PVRR. And I know, Eddie, there's a field in SPDs that we can discuss that in more detail tomorrow. And so the forecast is a separate issue, but the actual life cycle cost, once again, so if an asset's 60 years, or in 61 years, are we going to have to come back and say what the actual life cycle cost was when we remove the asset?
So I'll go ahead and mention, certainly, you're talking about long periods of time. There are a lot of, I guess, more variances and uncertainties. However, I would suspect, though, that to the extent that a value can be assessed, it's better than just operating blindly and pretending that, we don't know what this information will be. Therefore, we cannot consider that as part of the cost for this mitigation. At this point, at any point in time, the commission's going to have to make decisions based upon, the best program in terms of costs and benefit for customers. So while the data may not be as refined as it will be over time, that shouldn't stop, or I wouldn't think that should stop the commission from having the best available information at the time that can at least provide some basis for understanding and comparing different alternatives and different risk mitigation programs.
Yeah, Vincent, go ahead.
I just want to say, we're not. I just feel like, as far as these fields are concerned, it's the kind of wrong place to look at these total life cycle costs. Just feel like it's the wrong place, and like Dan mentions, there's a lot of complexity, a lot of which I'm not aware of, but I'm pretty sure there's a lot of complexity when it comes to looking at realized project life cycle costs, right? And to what your statement you made earlier, Chris, is like when you're looking at mitigations programs you want to put in place for the future, you will look at the forecast of the total life cycle cost, not the actual total life cycle cost, but the forecast of the total life cycle cost. And the correct kind of path of inquiry would be, how are those forecasts derived? Right? I think that's what you want to. They might be derived based on actual life cycle costs that happen over some period of time. But the correct question to ask is, what's the forecast going forward? So, sure, we want to look at the actual forecast cost, but I kind of feel like this is not really the place, because I'm pretty sure we will, like Dan says, the age of the assets one issue, but there's also other things to consider. I feel like, it's a bit beyond what, we're able to do in this report. So, probably if I want to look at this, I need to bring this to our kind of accounting people, utility accounting people, to see how they think about this. And so I don't feel like this is the place to talk about this report anyway.
Yeah, Chris, did you want to reply to that?
Yeah, thank you. There are a number of things that could also lend support for why the commission would want to have that actual life cycle cost. So I mentioned one, for example, having an understanding of the overall life cycle of a mitigation, so that something's not being left out that would maybe influence authorization for one mitigation over another. There are mitigations that are being implemented that are kind of, from a long history, they're novel for the commission, right? Even the extent of new cover conductor, do we actually have a lot of confidence that the cover conductor will hold up to the elements and the other aspects of it that might affect the life. I know that, for example, in Australia during wildfires, they implemented a new program. I think it was called ABC cabling. It was a bundled cabling where they replaced conductors with cable conductors that I think were all bundled together. And then some years later, they were finding that, and this was to reduce wildfire risk, that these cables were shorting out and actually causing, wildfires. That's not to say that, the commission's going to have that result, but there's these potentials for mitigation programs to in the relatively near future of 5 years or so on, to uncover some kind of action that needs to be adjusted. And so having the information on whether the asset life is achieving what's anticipated will be good to have sooner than later. Another mention, let me just think a second. So like in pole replacement, like we in a GRC, I think in Southern California in 2015, I think it was, it was, I believe, something on the order of 8 billion, could have been more, in terms of negative salvage cost to remove, poles. And that should be understood even in selecting the type of pole or where the poles are going to go. So all of that information, the commission, there are benefits to having the information. And I understand, Vincent, that you're talking about not having all of it, but to the extent that it can be estimated would be valuable. Another thing just off the top of the head was, I think, some utilities may be undergrounding at a lower depth than traditional in the past, but understanding how that is working in terms of undergrounding not at the same depth that it may have been undergrounded in the past. Does that make it more vulnerable to dig-ins or to wildfires that are in the area? So I think that there is a value in being able to estimate this information, and to the extent it's not perfect, it can be improved over time.
I kind of wanted to ask a question, or it's kind of a clarifying question, I guess. In light of what we've been discussing here, and like, it sounds like for the forecast total life cycle, I mean, it's an estimate essentially, and but the actual total life cycle cost it does sound like, Chris, you're asking for an update, and you're asking for these templates to be provided on an annual basis. And so I guess that just raises a question for me about, like, especially in the project template, do you envision that the RRU is gonna, once it's reported in a ramp, it's that RRU would just remain in the database until the RRU is salvaged, essentially, and there would be annual updates for that RRU throughout the life of that RRU?
So there's always opportunities to, improve the templates, but I guess as an initial response to that would be that if, let's say, in a worst case example, all of a sudden some mitigation were being implemented, and then during the course of the GRC, it was found that there was some kind of challenge with it. So then all of a sudden the life cycle would be much shorter. The life cycle cost would be much greater because it's maybe going to have to be removed earlier. And having that information reported as soon as it becomes available for that RRU, then that would be useful. I think as it stands now, the templates are to be annual. And so it's, I don't think it's that specific in terms of when would it drop off
Okay.
being reported on the RRU template.
Okay.
But I guess that's what the IOUs are trying to figure out, is how we would actually implement this. Because to Eddie's question, if I have to continue to just track RRU projects for 60 years, the number of RRUs will be in the millions potentially.
Could
And
I
especially the other field to the left, the actual mitigation asset life. So once again, we would have to monitor at a project level how long that covered conductor lasted. And, once again, we're never saying anything's 100% effective. Even undergrounding is, 99. And so just because something fails in service doesn't mean it wasn't effective. It's just there are natural instances where it will fail. And so it's just, to me, it's not clear like how we would fill this out on an annual basis, because of the specific actual fields that you're asking for here make it seem like we would have to continually track every RRU until the project lifetime is completed.
Well, I was wondering if I could make a suggestion about that. I was thinking, would it be possible to at least provide annual updates up to the moment where the project is used and useful, so that you're, especially with regards to actual cost, you're basically updating the amount of cost that you're accruing year over year. But then once the project is used and useful, essentially the RRU doesn't necessarily need to be annually updated unless something changes about it. If there's an update, like you say, Dan, maybe the project or the RRU suddenly is incapacitated, that would be a moment in time where you would need to inform the commission that this RRU is, the asset life is up, and we're updating some information in the database.
Well, I mean, there's also maintenance. So just because it fails doesn't mean we have to completely replace it. So I don't like it. I think a lot of these fields may seem like it's an easy number to implement, but when you look at it in real life at a very granular level across thousands and thousands of projects, it just isn't that straightforward or simple how you would produce these values.
Okay. Chris, was my possible solution, like, did that make sense to you?
Yeah, and so it seems at one end, it would be that the RRU is reported in the template until its life cycle were complete. Another end of that spectrum would be as soon as it became used and useful. And so I think that would be something that we would probably discuss among ourselves, because I can also imagine there could potentially be something, in between those two bookmarks, perhaps one where, for the next 5 years after it's put into service, or some other, time frame, that it would continue to be reported. And I also heard you also maybe mention another possibility of where, if there were some kind of change, so that this RRU was not going according to what was forecast, some significant level, then that would cause a reporting of it to flag it for people. So it seems like there's some different ways of addressing that, and I think we would probably want to talk it through on our end to kind of see what folks might have. But that's a good point.
Okay.
I would just note the RSAR does track costs on an annual basis, and there is a requirement to talk about canceled deferred projects. So once again, I feel like that is already covered somewhere, maybe not at the RRU type level, but once again, that is because there's thousands and thousands of potential RRUs that it would be, obviously it would be resource intensive potentially, but also it's not clear what value all that would bring.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Maybe Chris, I just had a couple of other questions that I wanted to clarify. Let's see. I think it's. I was just curious about the timeline for installation, and and then you have like a variable for timeline of installation, and then additional year variables. I think it's in the project. And I guess I was wondering what the timeline for installation refers to first. Is that just the construction timeline? Is that what that's referring to?
Yeah, so this was to have an understanding when there's a project, it may bridge across different GRC periods, or it may be all contained within a GRC period. I think there's other fields where we're talking about, year 1, year 2 of the GRC. So this was to be able to have insight into, okay, yeah, this one is not all contained within one GRC, and if it's going to take more than, say, 1 year to install.
Okay, so the year 1, year 2 is referring to the GRC. It's not referring to the life time. Yeah, it's not referring to the timeline of the installation. it's specific to like the test year and then the 3 post-test years.
Well, for this field here,
Not this field,
okay.
the ones below. Yeah, that year 1 cost, year 1 actual, like those.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so
because it says RRU implementation. And yeah, I just want.
So I think I need to correct myself because this does talk about the project. So it would have specific to the first year of the project, and this one I guess would could carry over different years that could also carry over between GRCs.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is like if this is referring to the installation of the or the implementation of the RRU, then technically I think you have 4 years listed. Is that right? Or is it just 3? But my question was just that it could be more than that, right? Some projects might actually have an implementation period, or especially for mitigations, they may have an implementation period that's more than 1 year. So the utility would just add additional years to this.
Yeah, I guess this was intended to capture, I would imagine many projects can be implemented within a couple of years, but you're right. I imagine that some could carry on for beyond 4 years. So yes.
And then for O&M, how would you envision this working, this particular variable? Would it just carry on indefinitely for O&M projects, or
Yeah.
are you?
So, yeah, if the utility were like, I guess one example I suppose would be vegetation management. So if a utility were, anticipating, its vegetation management, it would have to specify the first year. So like on this top row, it would begin, say, with 2025 and then show what it would be for the following year. So each of these is reported annually. So one thing that this might help the commission better understand, for example, if a utility is expecting that, in a different project that might be cover conductor undergrounding, let's say undergrounding, that is going to then offset vegetation costs, then we would expect that, for the year 1 of this report, for it to then show that year 2, the subsequent year would see a reduction in vegetation management. It would be visible now to see what kind of reduction in vegetation management is the utility anticipating, or is it not? Is it going to continue the same level of vegetation management costs?
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts or questions about the timeline? If not, I think I'll ask like kind of a couple structural questions just about the project template. There was I think you have like an RRU ID at the top, and I was just wondering if you had a specific form or like approach to generating an RRU ID, or would you just leave that up to the utility to determine?
Yeah, so these templates didn't try to specify that. It's not to say, excuse me, the commission might decide that they want to have a specific, format for that, but these projects, these templates didn't try to specify that. So potentially it could be up to the utility, or if the commission wanted to standardize on some kind of format, it could be used similarly for across all the utilities.
And then, but then, I guess one of the reasons I asked this is because I don't see like any fields related to like risk or mitigation program, and you know, I mean, we already talked about tranche, but I was just curious about how you would tie the RRU back to the actual mitigation program.
You know, that's a very good point. Just like as we've learned from the other presentations and today, is that it would make sense to include the tranche, the program level, so that we have that. Even if the project RRU template has a file name or something, it would make sense to include it explicitly in here so that folks don't have to make assumptions or something like that.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. But at just a high level, do you expect that this would be like you would have one of these project templates for each mitigation? Or if you added in those fields, then maybe that wouldn't be necessary. It could be one data set. But yeah, I was just curious at how you were envisioning the Excel files looking essentially.
And maybe just, I think I have a very similar question, Eddie, you might help Chris in your answer is, I thought I heard earlier that you were expecting one Excel file per RRU. And so I was wondering, is that the case, or is it tabular or others? Because if it's per file, I mean, that would literally be thousands of Excel files, I think would be completely overkill. So just wanted to make sure that I was clarifying is, would you expect it to be, I understand this is a different format, columns versus rows, but would you expect it if you went over to like the B template, that it would be a row per RRU and not a file per RRU?
Yes, we envisioned it would be one file per program. So for the project template, this would be every single project under that one program. So if it's an undergrounding program, it would be all the undergrounding projects.
Okay.
And then a different file for a different program and the sub projects.
And maybe just to clarify, it doesn't necessarily have to be a separate file. It could just be a separate spreadsheet within the file. Is that right, Anna? Or do you?
It could.
Uh-huh.
It could be if you're referring to tabs, it could be,
Yeah.
but
Uh-huh.
in terms of comparison purposes, I think that may be more difficult to flip back and forth between different tabs to compare. So our initial thoughts was a different Excel spreadsheet or different file per program.
Okay. I mean, yeah, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just follow up again. So basically, if you go to the project tab, so you have RRU and you have information. And I think Eddie asked that, and maybe you reply, but do you have the similar thing for alternative in the same table? Meaning that do you expect utilities to calculate all of these like cost, risk at our level that we can compare with a like proposed in this table or in the next tab, which is alternative, which is I think at a program level.
So
go ahead.
I'll just say for clarifying purposes, these are what our proposed templates actually look like. These are just our guidelines that we threw in just so we don't have to share different files. But I don't, well, maybe you want to chime in, Chris, but I think initially we figured the alternatives could either be under the same program tab as all the program, just so we had them all side by side comparing, the proposed program versus the alternatives, so we can see it all together. But if anyone feels that it might be more efficient separately, that's something we can consider as well. Then I don't know if you want to chime in, Chris.
So
Yeah, no,
my question was, sorry, Chris, to interrupt you. So my question was, you don't expect to get alternative information as granular as project or RRU level?
I'll go ahead and jump in there. So as this example, so this was this tab that Anna is sharing now. It was because as we went through the templates and as we've been through, recent ramps, it would make sense to us that there be a structured data set that it doesn't have to be the end all, but that the commission would have a real benefit if they had this template type data to compare alternatives. And to your question, Amin, about should it be at the project level? So this example shows it at the program level, that alternatives tab that Anna is sharing. However, you know, I could imagine a case could be made for having it at the project level. There could be where an alternative at a program level would be very different, you know, in terms of comparing two different programs. But when it gets down to the project level, you might get a different result. So I could imagine that alternatives at the project level could have value. I know that would be additional data. However, I can imagine there could be, like in one instance for one project, one alternative might make the best sense, and in another alternative, for another project, another alternative might make the most sense. And the thing that's lost is if that comparison is only done at the program level, is it won't necessarily optimize projects, because it'll be like looking at it, picking this is a program that's going to be authorized, whereas it could be that you might get a much more granular targeted mitigation that's more cost effective if it were considered at the project level. So it would mean more data, but I can imagine that there could be reasons and cost efficiencies for doing that. So, but anyway, this example doesn't show that, but I can understand there could be a reason for it.
Thank you.
Was this tab shared? I didn't see this tab in your template.
No,
Okay.
it wasn't. It was brought up just for this presentation, to also, because we had some discussions earlier this week about alternatives. And so this was also we looked at that and we thought, oh, you know, the templates could have a place for capturing data that would make it more easier for the commission to and for the utilities present information when they're analyzing alternative mitigations. So this is here for today. It wasn't part of the original spreadsheet.
Yeah, because once again, I would note anything from the GRC for alternatives and actuals for alternatives doesn't make any sense. We are, if it's the alternative, the one we didn't go through with, we will never have actuals. And in the GRC, we typically do not present multiple forecasts, so it's really more of a ramp thing than it is a GRC.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Yeah. Sorry, Chris, you came up mute. Did you have something?
The only thing I was going to say is, you know, kind of like a recurring theme here is if, you know, this is, you know, rather than try to tailor any of this to a particular scenario, this is to, you know, present the data, and to the extent that it's not applicable or isn't useful, or there's no, the data is not being gathered. And I shouldn't say it isn't useful, but to the extent it's not applicable or the data isn't there, the template would just be a blank, it'd be the cost of a blank cell. And but it is like, because there was discussion about alternatives, it does seem like there could be value, because that's a big issue, I believe, in like the general rate cases, trying to figure out the funding level for different alternatives. So there is a need for that kind of stuff.
I would note, though, the alternatives, it's not like if we had an RRU project, like if we said we were going to maybe shift miles from, you know, undergrounding to covered or other things of that nature, it's not like each individual RRU may go in between different alternatives. It would be at a more programmatic level that we may have underlying data that's all hypothetical, but like not every RRU would have an alternative if we have a different alternative plan for how we may address like hardening or other things. So I just want to make that clear. Just because we investigate moving from miles from one, you know, program to another doesn't mean that every RRU would have two different alternatives. Some may be on part of the risk curve where it says okay, but not every RRU should necessitate having two different alternatives. And
Yeah,
that was
I
even
hear you.
more clear when you go outside of wildfire, which is, you know, a lot of what this is designed for.
Got it.
Yeah, that I can understand that, and that's maybe something that we can have a further conversation about tomorrow, because we're going to be talking quite a bit about how our templates are handling the proposed and alternative mitigations at the RRU level, and so happy to carry on that conversation tomorrow as well. And then I have like one other kind of in the weeds question, and then maybe we'll open it back up to like some general conversation. The location field in the project template. I just wanted to know what were you envisioning to be actually the field value? Like, what you say the geospatial data format as a separate file, but are you thinking of like a link that would be a link to that geospatial data, or what would be in that field value?
Yeah, so that field really is more or less a placeholder.
Okay.
I'm not familiar myself, and exactly the best way to do that. You know, I know that they've figured that out to a large extent with WMP data, and I believe that other folks in our branch are familiar with how that can capture some outage data or EPSS data. So I can't myself right now answer that question, but in terms of the template, it was more of a placeholder. I think, you know, our main key point with this presentation was that this information would be invaluable for the commission and parties, and so it's I don't know whether that's been included in, you know, the other proposals, but we Cal Advocates is definitely you know, wanting to keep that, as we did when we presented that you know, walkthrough in 2023. We also kind of gave a similar walkthrough about how this location information is useful. But yeah, it's just that it's not meant to say latitude, longitude, because it's going to go beyond that, you know.
Well, actually, is Frankie still on? Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I was just wondering, Frankie, I was just wondering if do you would you be able to maybe I mean just maybe I guess my suggestion would just be would it be possible to kind of refine the expectation of what you are envisioning in that field, and then are you not thinking about long lat? Do you not need that as well, or is just the geospatial data enough for what you need?
So it kind of depends on, I mean, that those are the details that haven't really been hashed out yet. So it really kind of depends on what's needed, right? So long lat typically will refer to point location. So that may whatever is going to be relative to the actual risk mitigation, right? So I think somebody mentioned earlier there are things that don't have a geospatial relevance, right? For instance, like cybersecurity may not have some sort of geospatial tied to it. So that could be so that in itself is a different thing. May not actually require some sort of spatial data. The spatial data I'm looking for would be things for like if somebody was if a utility was doing an undergrounding project, well, it would be great to have a shapefile or a line or a you know some sort of essentially like a shapefile that represents the overhead that's removed and then represents the undergrounding that was subsequently installed, or just whatever was like, because there's cases where it's just overhead being removed, right? So that could be the case. Whatever is relevant to the specific projects is probably going to be the most likely thing that would be requested. That way, most of the data would have already been captured in the tabular data. So the geospatial aspect of it only needs to be a shapefile with a key that could tie it back to the tabular data. Otherwise, I think somebody was had mentioned the duplicative work, right? So otherwise you would have basically, you could potentially have all the tabular data in the geospatial data, if anybody here is familiar with GDBs.
Right.
So there's a lot of options. The details I don't believe have really been hashed out yet. But ultimately, the most important thing is to have projects tieable to the tabular data. So something to connect a shapefile back to the tabular data.
Yeah.
That way we can perform spatial analyses.
I guess my suggestion would just be like if there could be some language that's clear about like what the expectation is for this field, and it may be very valuable to the commission and they may want to include it, but they're going to want to know what direction to give the utility in order to make sure that you get the data that you want, and to make sure that if it is relevant to something outside of the wildfire context, that the language be flexible and open enough so that you could get the spatial data that you need for something that's not wildfire. Because right now, I think the spatial data piece of this is maybe a little bit wildfire centric, and maybe you and Chris could kind of. My suggestion would just be maybe you could put your heads together a little bit and think about like how could you create some wording that could make it relevant to risk outside of wildfire, and then also provide kind of like some type, I don't know if exemption is the right word, but make sure that the language is specific enough that RRUs that do not have spatial data aren't required to provide it, because then it doesn't really make that much sense. So that would just be my 2 cents on that. That way, it appears to the commission that it's understandable what's expected, and that they would feel comfortable wanting to include this requirement.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good idea. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, just one clarifying question. You mentioned that we need a primary key to connect the tabular data to GDP data. So do you think we can do that through RRU ID, or do we? I mean, I think you mentioned something like that, but do you think we need, because we need a unique one-to-one? So what would you suggest? I don't want to put you in a corner, but if you have something in your mind, please share with us. That what's the primary key or keys that you connect up, because you don't want all the data in a special data. You want data in tabular and just connect them to special data. So what do you think, how we can connect them?
Yeah, no, I appreciate your question. That was kind of, I think the RRU unique identifier. Well, presumably it's a unique identifier, right? Specific to the specific project or whatnot. That theoretically could serve as the primary key. I haven't seen enough of it to determine if that's sufficient, and if it isn't, then that's kind of where the discussion would need to go. So that's probably something that needs to be discussed a bit more to identify what would be a suitable primary key for that differentiation.
Yeah, if I might jump in front of you, just a follow-up. So your template has a time to it. So maybe you want RRU and some element of time, like, I don't know, the effective date, because the progress in RRU in like last year would be different next year. So maybe it would be RRU plus like some effective date as well. Just some suggestion. That's it from me. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, we need to go through the exercise, I think. But I think, RRUID could be like a key, if you will. But as I mentioned, if we have to provide a public and confidential version because of locational and risk information, there may need to be an anonymized RRUID that links to the RRUID that links to your file, so we just need to think about it. Like I said, there is the issue of locational specific data can be considered confidential in most cases, because once again, if it's made public in these proceedings, bad actors can determine which poles or which structures, if you wanted to do an arson, would have the biggest potential consequences downstream. So I think in general, you could do it. It's just there's that added layer that it may have to have a file that maps the anonymous ID to location. But once again, you can do it. It's just another layer of complexity.
Yeah, go ahead.
But if you do that, one thing is that I think it would need to be clear that you wouldn't always restart redo those anonymized IDs. I think that has become an issue for us, is that you're changing them all the time, so you can't have we can't even track them.
And another suggestion is RRU ID doesn't need to have location information. It's just an ID that we might have a lookup table connecting it to location, but RRU ID doesn't need to have like a special, like, I don't know, latitude or longitude to show where they are.
Yeah, I think that
be
could be right. Depending on how the actual template comes out and how it does it, it's possible RRUID wouldn't need an anonymous version. I'd have to think about it more implementing it, but you're right, that's possible it wouldn't.
Frankie, did you want to add something to that?
No, I was just going to comment the exact same thing. It's definitely possible. It needs to kind of that's the part where I was saying that it definitely needs some sort of discussion. Because the details, again, in my presentation, is like the purpose of whatever spatial data we'll be using has to be rather clear, and before we even start talking about the details beneath it, because otherwise we'd just be running around in circles. So
thanks, Frankie. I'll just kind of reiterate that like when you guys submit your data template on the 18th, that's as clear as possible. I think that's going to help the commission out quite a bit. So just a thought on that particular topic. Okay, great. I'm gonna. I don't have any detailed questions. I don't know if anybody else has any other detailed questions that they wanted to ask about the template. But if there's not, then I'm happy to kind of like open it up to kind of a broader discussion on the Cal Advocates template. If somebody wanted to ask another high-level question. And I will give it a few minutes. If we all feel comfortable with where we had the conversation at before the break, then we can start to wrap up.
I have a wrap-up question, if you will, but
yeah.
If you want to give others a couple minutes still to.
Yeah, go ahead. Ask your wrap-up question, and maybe.
And I think we asked this last Friday. It was, I think we're trying to understand procedurally, like if there will be an opportunity for comments, especially I think because, I think parties are potentially going to make updates to their templates, and so they're going to submit another round. And I think, I don't know procedurally how it'd be, even if it's like just opening comments or just one round. I think it would be helpful because, there may be changes to templates that after we see them, we're more supportive of an overall template from other parties and things. So just wondering, like procedurally, like, is this something you can talk to the ALJ and maybe let us know Thursday or Friday or should we be under the assumption that we need to file some ruling, or just any guidance you may have would be appreciated? Yeah,
I can definitely take that back, and I don't know for certain that I'll have an answer by Thursday or Friday. That's really, it's a decision that has to be made by the decision makers. It's not a decision that staff can make. So, it's something that I'm not certain that I'll be able to get you an answer for Thursday or Friday. But thanks for raising that, and we will definitely bring it back for discussion amongst folks in the commission. Any other procedural questions? And if not, I think we'll go ahead and call this one as well. And there's going to be obviously some opportunity for discussion tomorrow. SPD is going to be presenting, and I won't make anybody come early to do a video test unless you really want to come see me. But so I guess we'll be the ones there at 9:30. Regarding, I'll just stop the recording. Regarding the recording for this particular workshop,